All right, welcome to our video about our presentation project, and we're going to be presenting to the Washington State Department of Ecology. All right, because if we were doing this, if we were making these propositions in real life, that's who we'd be talking to. There are a bunch of people, but the Department of Ecology would be one of the big players. Okay, we're going to talk about what you need to include. I'm going to go over some tips and or tricks for presenting, just some reminders, and then I'll do a sample presentation. Sorry, I'm a little bit tired this morning. And end by just going back over very quickly what's the information you actually need to include. All right, so without further ado, here goes nothing. All right, so we're going to start again with those tips, tricks, and reminders. So you are more than welcome to do voice over PowerPoint. That's what I'm doing right here. Okay. You can do it using Adobe Acrobat or something similar. So the something similar might be, for example, I like using a program called ScreenPal. And ScreenPal is free to record up to 15 minutes, which is plenty for what we're doing today. Okay. Worth knowing when we're doing something like this. The writing does need to be original to you. That means you're creating it all on your own. You're not using AI or anything similar. Okay, but you do not need to have your face on camera, so you're welcome to just use your voice like I'm doing right now. Okay, but you can also use some kind of an AI generator to read it or someone else. As long as the text is your own, that's all I ask. Otherwise, I'm cool. Okay. Because it is a presentation that we are making to a state department, there do need to be visuals involved. The easiest visuals to use and what you would use if you were doing this via video conference would be some kind of a PowerPoint or a Google slide deck presentation. Okay. It wouldn't be a poster. If we were doing it in person, you might use posters potentially, but you'd probably even then still be using something like Google Slides or PowerPoint. Okay. So what your video is going to include, you need to introduce the dam by telling me where it's located. Probably the easiest way to do that is to show a map. Okay, that's going to be the easiest way to show where it's located. Give a brief statement about the impact on the local environment or culture. Okay, how has it changed things? What does it mean to have that particular dam and that particular reservoir right there? Okay. Talk a little bit about stakeholder views and concerns about the dam. Okay. Some for, some against, potentially. But the people who are going to be affected by the decision, what do they think? You need to provide some evidence to justify your decision, and we'll talk in a minute about what that would look like. Okay. And then you're going to make a recommendation about what should happen with the dam, including expected impacts on stakeholders. And when I say expected, what I mean are potential or reasonably foreseeable. Which is really a fancy schmancy way of saying, what do we think might happen realistically? Okay, what do we think might happen realistically? So examples might be that forests recover, or there's struggles for irrigation with farmers, maybe that salmon populations will recover, okay, things like that. Things like that. That's what I mean when I say reasonably foreseeable. Okay. Worth knowing, by the way, there are no right or wrong recommendations with regards to whatever dam you might choose to discuss. Only good or bad recommendations based upon the evidence you provide and the potential impacts for the stakeholders involved. So recommend to keep the dam, recommend to blow the dam up, that's up to you based on what you learn. Okay. Your goal really is kind of the most good for the most people. So the most good for the most people. Doesn't mean you're going to minimize everyone's problems with it. Okay. But it does mean you're going to do the best you can to make sure that for as many people as possible, those are pretty minimal. Some people are just going to have bigger impacts than others, and that's okay. All right. That's okay. You just need to mention those negative impacts. And again, negative impacts are things like farmers struggling to irrigate their fields. Irrigate means that they bring water in from another location. Your video itself is going to take somewhere between probably 1.5 to 5 minutes, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more. Okay. The exact length depends on the pace at which you talk, how much detail you provide, and other similar sorts of things. Don't worry if it's a little short or a little long. I don't grade on length for things like that. Okay. I grade on content. So make sure your information is good. If your information is good, that's where you're golden. Okay. Right? And that includes things like being on camera or using your own voice. Obviously, I love to see kids and I love to hear your voices. I do. I'm a teacher, right? But I'm not going to penalize you for those things. Okay. I don't particularly enjoy being on camera. That's why most of my videos tend not to include my image. That's okay. Focus on content. Do a good job with that, and the rest will be fine. Okay. So some quick reminders about your slide decks. That last one I had, and really even this one, where it's like basically a novel written on it, is what you generally want to avoid with slides. I'm doing this so that you can see it in writing and read it if you need to, if that's what helps you. But typically when you're doing a public presentation, you don't do that. Okay. You want to keep your written text short, and you'll see where I do that in my sample presentation. Right? Should be short and to the point. And graphics. Provide pictures of things. Okay? Because that's what your audience is really going to be interested in looking at. Do too much else and it starts to distract from your presentation. In general, what you want to do is simple backgrounds with a high contrast. So, for example, black on white, like what I did right here, right? This is probably the most simple you can get, and it forces you to focus on what's on the slides. Okay? You could also do things like yellow on purple or red on black, things like that. Bolding can help if you feel like the contrast is a little bit borderline. That's what I did with the red on black, is I bolded the text and it became much more readable. Okay? I'm not saying don't have fun with the slides and things like that. Just make sure that they're readable. And if you are struggling to read it, then your audience will too. And if you're not sure, since you know exactly what it says, call a friend, call a family member, right? Have somebody come over and just take a look, and they'll tell you if it's too hard to read. Okay. What else? Your fonts should be at least 24 points on your slides. Anything too much smaller than that, and it starts to get harder to read. So, for example, that line right there is a 26. Okay, it's a 26-point font, so it's nice and easy to read. You start getting down into the teens, and it gets significantly harder to read from anything resembling a distance. Okay. All right. Doing the actual presentation. Script yourself out. Script yourself out. It's okay to just read directly. I do it all the time when I make videos. I promise I do that. Okay. Practice your presentation before you film it. This will make sure you read smoothly and you know where the natural breakpoints are. You know where you're going to stop and take a breath, right? You know where you're going to need to pause to change the slides, things like that. You'll just kind of know. You'll have a feel for the rhythm of it if you practice. Pro tip, Microsoft PowerPoint and Google Slides will both let you insert notes below the slide that can then be printed off as a PDF to read from for your script, to make sure you're changing the slides at the right part, right? And to make sure you say everything you want to say, that you don't leave anything out. I've been known to save my PowerPoints as a PDF with the notes and then use a tablet if I'm shooting off of a single screen, right? And I read from the PDF on the tablet while I've got the slide projected on one screen. What I'm doing right now, I have two screens, right? So I don't need to worry about that. But easy to do. If you're not sure, by all means, ask for help. Okay. It's okay to goof up a little bit when you're presenting, and you'll notice, like, I coughed earlier, I say sometimes, things like that. Makes you human. Okay. If you feel like you're goofing up a lot, stop yourself. Go take a breath or two, right? Maybe practice once or twice more, and then come back and do it again. It'll go much, much smoother. Okay. Do make sure that you take regular breaths and that you slow yourself down. It's very easy when you're doing anything like this to get super nervous and start talking really, really fast. And when you do that, it makes it really, really hard to understand you, right? Kind of like what I was just doing, where all of a sudden my words start to slur a little bit more. I'm not articulating my hard consonants. It just becomes harder to understand me. So slow yourself down, take regular breaths, and try to speak clearly. Hard consonants, by the way, are things like D's and T's. So this is an old theater trick, is that when you're up in front of an audience, you want to try really hard to articulate your hard consonants. And you'll do that, and it makes the rest of it much easier to understand. Okay? Worth knowing, I hate making videos too. It's probably the part of the job I hate some of the most. Grading's worse, not gonna lie. But videos is a close second to grading in terms of teacher work. Okay? I get it. I genuinely do. Do your best. You'll be okay. You'll be okay. We'll get you sorted. Okay. All right. So I said you had to develop an evidence-based recommendation. Most of the rest of this you should already be familiar with, right? You should know who the stakeholders are. You should have some ideas of positives and negatives. But we haven't talked much about evidence-based recommendations. Okay. So what does that really mean? It means that the information you're going to give, the position you're going to take, is backed up by data or by scientific literature. This is a study done to provide evidence for a claim. Right? There are literally whole companies that do these studies. I know, my wife works for one. Right? And this is part of what she does, is she writes these kinds of papers where she's making these kinds of recommendations and things. Okay? What would that look like on your slides? Might be graphs, charts, tables, statistics from studies that highlight the scientific evidence for the claim. And what I've got here on the right side of the slide, okay, is something that would work. So we've got a graph here, right? And the source for this is the Pacific Salmon Commission. And what the graph shows is that across time, from 1984 forward, right, the total abundance of Chinook salmon have been decreasing. That means they're going down, right? So in the Salish Sea in 2010, which is where our data ends, right, there were just over 485,000 Chinook salmon. That's a 60% reduction since they began monitoring salmon data in 1984. So there's 60% fewer salmon available in the Salish Sea. That's a problem. That's a problem. You can find these kinds of graphs and things, by the way, by doing Google searches. I don't need you to dig through tons and tons of paper and scientific research studies to look for them. But you should be able to find them in some of what we've already gone through and some of the research you've already completed. Okay, and if not, you can try Google and see what you can find with Google Images. All right, so I promised you that I would do a presentation example of what this might look like. So here goes nothing. All right, so this is a tale of two dams, the Elwha and the Glines Canyon Dam. And both of these dams were on the Elwha River and were located in Olympic National Park. We're going to pretend that they're still there, that they weren't. The last of them wasn't removed a little over a decade ago. All right. So our general information, where are they located? So the Glines Canyon Dam, that's this one right here. You can see my mouse, right? It's actually inside the park. You can see it's on the Elwha River system here. The Elwha Dam is actually outside of it. And what I can tell you is in both cases, we've got some reservoirs. So that's this kind of thicker area along the river here. It's a little bit like a long lake. Okay, this is where the water has been backed up by the dams okay, so that it can be released slowly and steadily and as needed. All right, so our stakeholder perspectives. Okay. By the way, you should probably have more information about your dam, maybe what size the reservoirs are and things like that. Just some more general information. I didn't have much time for this week. All right, so first stakeholder, local tribes, right? The lower Elwha Klallam tribe has a connection to the Elwha River dating back thousands of years. So those connections are both cultural and in terms of food, religion, things like that. They have tribal rights to any salmon in the river. And they have a distinct interest in maintaining the health of the river, the ecology around the river, and obviously any life in the river. So their goal is to help and maintain salmon stocks and the river itself. All right, costs and benefits to farmers. The dams provide a stable source of irrigation for farmland. So in other words, farmers never have to worry about where the water is going to come from for their crops. Okay. They also don't have to worry about flooding. So removing the dams could pose some real significant problems potentially for the agriculture industry. They would have to adapt what they're doing and how they're doing it in order to adjust to that new life. All right, so environmentalists. There's a lot of different environmental impacts to consider. So obviously it's going to change the landscape if these dams are torn down. The river's going to flood more often. The reservoirs will go away, which means we'll have some restoration of some of the forests and the shorelines that's going to need to go on, or that will happen naturally over tens of years, perhaps 100 or more. We'll also see some return of wildlife to some of those areas. Okay. But lots and lots of things to consider when we're talking about environmental impacts. Right, we've got a picture, for example, that's a small otter right there. Costs and benefits to the power companies. So anytime there's a dam, there's a power company, almost always, using the dam to generate electricity. And these particular dams, the Elwha and Glines Canyon dams, they have fueled historically the economy and growth of the Olympic Peninsula, right? They provide a lot of jobs within that region. So the power company is going to need to find a new source for power if these dams are torn down, and that might be windmills, that might be solar cells, right? They're just going to need to look at additional options for that, and that will entail some cost to them, Economically, it has the potential in the short term to drive up the cost of electricity while they're developing those and while they're installing them. Okay. So it is something we need to consider. Is that the most efficient and effective use of those particular resources? Okay. But they're not the only source. And so we see that, for example, in the Daishowa American paper mill in Port Angeles. These are generating only a small piece of the electricity. Sorry, my throat's getting a little sore. It's been a while since I've talked this much. All right. Then we've got the local communities themselves, right? Community members, there's a lot of costs and benefits. So not only are we've talked about some of this, right? We've talked about changing the source of power. It changes the recreational activities available and changes access to those. Right? And it has the potential to, again, create some problems. We talked about flooding with agriculture, but that also applies potentially to other communities as well, not just the farms. And it's going to change the tourist industry for the local area because we're changing those recreation opportunities. If we preserve the dams, on the other hand, now we're talking about we get to maintain those tourist activities, right? We get to maintain that power source, but we've got potential issues with salmon populations going down, and that's going to change the salmon fishing industry, potentially canning opportunities, and things of that sort. So those are our various stakeholder views. All right. So then our evidence, right? So you can see here, if you look at the graph, you can see the elevation is changing, or the maps, sorry. The elevation is changing. That's what this shows. So we've got 2011. This is actually as the dams are getting torn down. Okay. So the elevation is going up across time to 2017. We can see where there's an erosional trend that's changing. Erosion is when basically the dirt or the land is floated away because of the water. So we're reversing that. We're seeing less of that, and that's allowing that sediment to build up a little bit more, so that things look a little more like they did historically. And that's why I would go ahead and recommend that we get rid of these dams. Right? Because I think even though there's going to be a lot of upfront costs, obviously we're going to have teardown costs, we're going to have costs, economic costs related to replacing the power sources. But I think ultimately the landscape will recover, and I think there's going to be a lot of new opportunities that are going to come up and be found. Farming's a lot less common than it used to be, so we're talking about a lot fewer farmers, and there are other ways we can compensate those farmers, and maybe other crops we can help them grow, or we can help them relocate as needed. All right, so if I were doing this for a real presentation, this is the point where I would take questions. But instead, I'm just going to wrap the video because we're already at a super long video, okay, for this kind of thing. So, things to include. Make sure you introduce the dam by telling me where it's located. I did that with the map, right? I showed you where those two dams were at on a map. Talk about its impacts on the local environment or culture. We did a little bit of that, partially as we were going through. Okay, that's one of those things that you'll do a little bit up front, and then you'll weave it through as you're talking about stakeholders and things like that. You want stakeholder views and concerns about the dam. Some kind of evidence to justify your conclusion. I showed the erosion studies, right? Probably the better one to pick might have been the salmon population one that I used for the sample. Okay. And then you want to make some kind of a recommendation about what should happen to the dam. And that's where I said, I think we should remove it. Right? That's the recommendation right there. including the expected impacts on stakeholders. So I talked about farmers potentially being displaced or having to adopt new crops. I talked about economic impacts in terms of the cost of getting rid of the dam and of finding new sources of electricity. Right? I could have done a better job talking about the tribes and talking about the fishing industry being more. But those are the things you need to include in your presentation. And by all means, email me with questions or if you just need help with things, okay? This video, by the way, is about it's going to be about 26 minutes just to give you a feel for time. I definitely don't expect you to talk that long. Good luck. May the force be with you.